Welcome to the GPA conference and welcome to this section on 10 steps to become a better grant manager. How many of you are working with federal grants already? All right. Okay, so we're going to concentrate on federal grants in this session. How many of you are first-time attendees to the conference? Any first time? Wow! Yay! Let's give everybody, the first-timers, a little hand here. Welcome. I was a little late to the party myself, so I didn't start out. I just was in that phase of I'm all by myself. So I loved once I started coming to the conferences because I got to associate with other grant professionals. It was amazing. Now, sometimes you can't always travel, so this session is going to be live streamed, so why don't we just take a second and let's say hello to all of our virtual colleagues who are following along on the chat. Say hi. Hi. Welcome. Welcome. So they're attending as well. So the reach of GPA is going even farther. So we're going to focus on federal grant management in this session. And let's face it, it can be pretty confusing to manage federal grants. So one of my goals for this session is to help you. This is what I call my Uncle Sam thinking hat, kind of like the Harry Potter, wizarding thing. I like to get in the mind of Uncle Sam and try and figure out what are they really, first of all, what are they focused on? Are their priorities changing a little bit? And yes, they are. The uniform guidance kicked off not only a whole new set of regulations, but also a whole new set of priorities for the federal government. So I want to just take a minute and kind of get in their mind and go, okay, why are they asking me for this types of things? Because let's face it, communication is hard. Communication is hard between people, it's hard between departments, it's hard between organizations, it's hard between funders and recipients, all those things. Communication can be kind of a messy topic. So one of the things that we're going to go through today is not only to help you have a roadmap for success with your federal grants, but also talk about some best practices that will help you build relationships within your organization and with stakeholders in your communities and also with your federal agencies. So now I'm going to have a little bit of a bad hair day here because I've now kind of messed it up. And I want to just start with a couple of ground rules. First of all, anybody ever been to Las Vegas? Okay, what do they say in Vegas? What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. So our little elephant in the room here today is what happens in the GPA breakout session, stays in the GPA breakout session. Now, some of you might want to ask a question, and I want to applaud you for asking a question, and I'm not going to make you wait 75 minutes to do that. So if you have a question, my only request is that you go up to the mic so that that will be transmitted to our colleagues who are watching along. And if you want to present it as yourself, that's fine, or if it's a friend of a friend, or you heard this story from somebody else, fifth or sixth hand, that's okay too. And if you're not comfortable actually asking the question in public, I'll be around for a few minutes after the session too, so I want to make sure that your questions get answered. But let's face it, federal grant management is a bit of a complicated topic. Now, it might have started very simply for you because you wrote a grant and your boss said, congratulations, now you get to manage it. Okay, maybe some of you can relate to that. Maybe you started somewhere else and you thought, I'm going to go to work for a nonprofit because I'm passionate about the mission, and all of a sudden you got some federal money. So your life changed because somebody had to be keeping track of this. It can be a long and winding journey. I was speaking on Tuesday in Mississippi at a conference of the United Southeastern Tribes, and I knew I had to get to Washington for the GPA conference when I was considering that engagement. And so I looked and I thought, the best connections for me is to fly into Birmingham, Alabama, and drive. It's about 3 hours to where they were holding the conference, and then drive back, get on a plane, go to Florida, then go up to Washington, D.C. And I thought, but that's pretty straightforward because on Google Maps, I started out looking at Google Maps. I looked on Google Maps and said, oh, it's just simple. You come out of the airport, you get on I-20, you go this far, then you turn on this other road, and that other road will take you right to where you're trying to go. Okay, it's very straightforward. There was just a few problems, and this might relate to your grant story as well, when it seemed very straightforward when you wrote it and you got the money, but all of a sudden things start to change. For me, the first thing that changed was I'm driving down I-20 and there's a sign that says I-20 ends right in the middle of Birmingham, Alabama. Okay, well, surely all these other cars must know where they're going, so I'll just follow them because I don't know. I mean, I'm sure it picks up shortly. No, it didn't. It just dropped you into downtown Birmingham, Alabama, and there were no more signs. Okay, that can't be right. So I got back, headed back to the airport, drove around. I had taken a right with all the cars that went to the right, came around, went to the left with all the cars that went to the left. Again, dropped me off in this part of Birmingham, Alabama with no signs on where to go from there. So it felt a lot to me like grant management because I got this grant, it seemed very straightforward, but then there's all of these nuances that I was not aware of, and there was not clear direction. So I finally got that figured out. Fortunately, I was traveling with my GPS. I'm kind of an old-fashioned person. I don't like the directions on my phone. I still have, you know, the Garmin, the little Garmin thing that talks to me. And so I get down the road, and I'm on this little road, this country road, and I'm going, and I'm going, and I'm going. And my GPS can't find the city that I was supposed to be speaking in. But it did find the postal code, which I thought was odd. And finally, I got to this completely different city, and it said, "You are there." And I looked over and thought, no, I am not, because that's someone's front yard. So, okay, that can't be right. So I put it in. It was kind of odd. The address had 2 different addresses. So I put the other address in, and the GPS took me to that location, which again was someone's front yard, and said, "Here you are." And I said, "No, I'm not." And so much like when we manage grants, and sometimes we're very confused and we ask our funder, I thought surely somebody in a position of authority must know what to do. So I stopped at the local post office. And I said, "I am trying to find this location because I'm supposed to speak here tomorrow." And her response to me was, "Well, bless your heart." Now, I'm from northern Minnesota, and I didn't grow up hearing that expression a lot, but some of my southern colleagues have told me that means something like, "Have a nice day," or "I'm wishing you all the best," or something like that. And then she proceeded to give me a very long set of detailed instructions, which again got me very lost, and I couldn't find it. So I actually had to rely on someone else over in the subway who said, "Oh yeah, just take a right, it's right up at the top of the hill." So I was almost there. I just hadn't gone quite far enough, and I would have found it. But I didn't find it through the straightforward method when I first put it in Google Maps when I was looking to come. And so that is often, I think, a lot of us, not only how we get into grants, but also as we have that management journey. So my journey was a long and winding one. Now, I did not start out going, everything I want to know about grants, this is my life, this is what I want to do. But what I found is that it was very confusing. And I thought, if I'm confused, probably some other folks are as well. And so I got started down a path to help train grant recipients. And from there, I went into even more training and more writing all over the United States, and then also actually internationally, because I got to go to American Samoa about last January. Now, some of you, how many of you started as anything in the grant writing department? Some of you probably were started as grant writers. Okay, but most of you started right in the management in some way? I guess. Any people started like heads are going up and down. Okay, good. So I got started because I worked in the for-profit world, and at some point in my life, I got tired of working for the man in the big for-profit corporation, and I thought, I'm going to take that leap and I'm going to go to work for a nonprofit because I think this is going to be really cool. And so here I was. I did not as a little kid go, I want to be a grant manager. I didn't as a little kid say I want to be a CPA, but here I am, and I thought, okay, I'm going to go to work for this nonprofit because I'm passionate about the mission, and I don't know anything about grants, but surely they would not give us $100 million if someone didn't know what to do. And you know what they say about assumptions. So we're getting $100 million in funding, and I'm sitting in the meetings and I'm thinking, okay, they're talking about this whole alphabet soup. You know, it's the EVM and it's the MTDC and it's all this stuff. I had no clue what they were talking about. I remember when I was in college, I took one class called Fund Accounting, not fund like F-U-N, but fund, F-U-N-D. And the instructor, the very first night of class, said, "Welcome to accounting from the 1800s. And if you don't go to work for a government, you'll never use any of this." Okay, am I going to pay attention in this class? No, I don't think so. So here I am, I'm doing fund accounting, fund accounting. And I thought, well, I'm just going to kind of keep my head down, I'll do my part of the job, and surely someone must know what to do with federal grants. Only what happened? We got to the end of our big construction project and we had an audit finding. Now, for those of you who aren't working with accountants, finding just means the auditors come in and they find something, and they call it a finding. And that usually drives what's called a corrective action plan, or a CAP. And those go something like this: "We're sorry, we did it wrong, we won't do it that way again, and the reason we won't is because we're going to train people on the right way to do it." So that's when I first started really getting into training people on what to do with grants. Now, it wasn't a big dollar finding. It had to do with a really simple little thing where we had decided that it was an allowable cost to charge the federal government for blue jeans for our field staff because they were out doing very dusty, dirty work. And the federal agency had a different idea because they said they could go out a-dancing on Friday night in those blue jeans. So those were goods or services for personal use, and that's an unallowable cost. So we went back and forth and back and forth. And it made me realize you never know what little thing is going to trip you up. Even small dollar things, sometimes it's big dollar things, but even small dollar things can trip you up with your federal grants. The federal government, before the uniform guidance, before 2 CFR Part 200, which is the new set of regulations that I hope you are all on by now, used to have what they called a pay and chase strategy. In other words, we're going to pay you, and then we're going to come in and tell you you did it all wrong, and then we're going to chase you down for the money. That's really changed. What's changed is they're taking much more of a risk management approach to say, are you a pretty good bet to do the work or not? And the uniform guidance has implemented several things in that process where the federal agencies are evaluating whether or not you are the best choice for the money. Now, as a taxpayer and just kind of a logical thinker, I think that's a good thing, because why would we want to give millions of dollars to organizations that are not going to have a good chance of success in doing their mission? Anybody here work on the ARA grants back in 2008, 2009, when we had that shovel-ready jobs? What it was the federal government was shoveling out money as fast as they could, and all the recipients were shoveling out money as fast as they could, and then the sub-recipients everybody was shoveling money out the door, and there was not a lot of oversight, and as a result, there were a lot of bad outcomes. So I want to make sure that you're a successful grant manager. Now, success means different things to different people. You might all have a little different idea of what will make you successful as a grant manager. Here's my definition. First of all, no cost disallowed. That is my goal for you, that you never have cost disallowed. And number 2, you let it rain money, right? You get lots of grants because we want to solve some problems in our communities. This is what makes me sad, disallowed costs. This is what makes me happy when you get lots of grants. So let me ask you this fundamental question. Why bother to get grants? Anybody want to guess? Why get grants? Yes. Advance the mission of your organization. And that brave answer, which probably wasn't the first thing that everybody was going to holler out, has won you a door prize. Ding, 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 ding. The second edition that just came out about a week ago of Decoding Grant Management. Thank you very much. You're welcome. Okay, what is anybody else thinking in their mind when I ask that question of why get grants? How about if I go like that? Right? Right. And how does the federal government assist in that?
Money.
Money, that's the answer. Who said money? A whole bunch of people. Okay, so you said money. So you get the corresponding, because those are the 2 answers I was hoping to get. I'm going to just pass this down because I don't want to go too far here for the camera. Money. The federal government can print money. The federal government brings over $755 billion in grants to solve problems in our community. I may be wrong, but I have never found a bigger source of grant dollars than the federal government. And this chart's a little bit interesting because back in 2008, 2009, what was happening in 2008, 2009? Anybody remember those days? The Great Recession. So they wanted to stimulate the economy with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Okay, so they pumped all this money. We went from about $400 billion in grants up to almost $700 billion in grants in 1 year's time. That's why it was kind of crazy. Well, then what happened? It started to come down. You know, the economy's improving. You would expect that it would come down because there's not the same need to stimulate the economy. But then it starts going up again. And it kept going up. Now, a couple of years ago, my mom's 95 years old. She still lives in northern Minnesota. She calls me up after the change in administration and she says, honey, are you still going to have a job? Because I heard there aren't going to be any grants anymore. And she had seen that on the internet, and of course she believed everything she saw on the internet. And I said, well, Mom, you know, who knows? But I don't think it's going to go to zero. Probably not likely. There may be different priorities, there may be different amounts. Probably never going to go to that zero number. And in fact, what's happened is it's continued to increase. We are at the most grant funding right now in this point in our lives. And that should feel like opportunity to each of us as grant professionals, and should also feel like opportunities in our communities to solve problems. There's a lot of money out there to solve problems. So, we are objectives-driven people. What are our objectives today? We're going to walk through a 10-step roadmap for better grant management. And then we are going to identify some areas and methods that can cause bad relationships and how to improve them. And then we're going to discover some best practices. So just cutting to the chase, we're going to look at how we strengthen grant management, how we implement key practices, and how do we avoid those pesky little speed bumps that sometimes want to rip out the bottom of our car, want to rip out the bottom of our grant. So we're going to start by going step by step through the grant's life cycle. Now, I'm kind of an analytical thinker, which you might guess because I'm a CPA. And I thought, oh, there's so much to worry about with grants, because I like to read the uniform guidance for fun. There's just so much to worry about. And the way I organize things in my mind is I like to just kind of get everything out there, and then I start sorting through it. It was, even as a little kid, when I had to clean my room, I would take everything and pile it on the bed, and then I would sort through where everything had to go from that big pile on the bed. So I did this mind map, and I thought, oh my gosh, there's so many things that we have to worry about. And I thought, I can never present this. We would be here for days. So how do I take this data and go, okay, where are the likely risks to me as a grant recipient? How do I kind of narrow it down a little bit so that we're not having to focus on everything that could go wrong, but just the things that are probably most likely to cost us big bucks? And I sorted it down to 10 different areas. So that's where we're going to start. We're going to start at the beginning by looking at 10 of the main areas that are going to trip you up as a grant manager. And the difference in risk, think of it this way, when you look at that mind map and that scary look inside Lucy's brain, what are the odds if you leave your iPhone in the bathroom here at the hotel and you come back 2 hours later, it's going to be gone? Pretty high? Okay. What are the odds, and I hope this is not the same, but what are the odds if you leave your iPhone in your hotel room and come back 2 hours later, it's going to be gone? Hopefully pretty low. I hope that's a low risk. So there's a lot of things we could worry about. Let's focus on the things that are most likely to go wrong. So like leaving your phone in the iPhone in the bathroom. So we're going to take these kind of one at a time, and then after we get through these 10 different areas, then we're going to look at some best practices that build relationships to improve these areas, and then also some process strategies to improve these at your organization. Any questions before we move forward? No? Okay. All right, number one, start at the beginning. One of the common areas of risk that I see a lot of grant recipients get into trouble with is someone like a grant writer writes a grant, reads the notice of funding opportunity, and is not either aware or does not communicate when there are restrictions on how those funds can be spent. Any of you ever get a conference grant that doesn't let you buy food? And who wants to go to that conference? Not me, but there's a lot of HHS money that comes out not letting you buy food. Okay? I had another client, they had gotten a grant, and they had gotten it for many years. Every year they got funded, and they had done all these activities with it. And they called me up one day and they said, Lucy, our funders said these costs are unallowable, and we've always charged for these things. And I said, well, what things are we talking about? And they said, well, we have a program director, we have facility costs, we have all these things, we always have charged for these things. And now they said they're unallowable. They said, okay, did you ask them why they said they're unallowable? So they went back and they found out in the notice of funding opportunity, the funder had changed the kind of, I'll say, terms and conditions and focus that they had always had, and said, we're going to limit your costs to only pay when people actually go out and do this type of a training in a hotel somewhere. We're not going to pay for a program director. We're not going to pay for any facilities. So that just kind of got missed because everybody's in that, we're in that same old, same old. Or maybe you get a grant and the notice of funding opportunity is just what you thought it was, and the notice of award goes to your legal department who reads it, and there's a whole bunch of terms and conditions in there. and they just kind of read it and go, yep, we're going to sign it, and communication never gets any further than that. I had a client that they called me up and they wanted me to review their terms and conditions, and in there was a requirement that they encourage their employees not to text and drive. Where'd that come from? That's not in the uniform guidance, but somebody had stuffed it into their terms and conditions, and if they had not read it or not communicated it, they are not going to be in compliance because nobody was aware of it. So start at the very beginning. Make sure everybody from when you start the notice of funding opportunity all the way through the budget to the notice of agreement, all those areas, anything that's unusual, anything that's unexpected gets communicated downstream from there. Number 2, focus on the risk. This is my iPhone example. What are the chances of things going wrong? Well, if we have a budget that does not budget for equipment and people go out and buy equipment, that's a pretty high likelihood that things are going to go wrong. So if people are not aware of what the budget is, there's a pretty high probability that we will not spend the money correctly. The federal government has chosen to focus on risk from the standpoint of before they even give the money out. You, if you get funds and pass them through to someone else, also have a responsibility now in the uniform guidance to do a risk assessment of all of your subrecipients. There's one key difference between how the federal government approaches risk and how you as a pass-through do. The federal government assesses risk before they even decide who gets the money. You as a pass-through determine risk for your subrecipients to determine how much monitoring do we need to do. So let me explain that real quick. Let's say that I'm running a Head Start grant and I worked with this organization to run our Head Start program. Every year we sub-award to them, they do it. Next year we get funding, same old, same old. They've been around for 20 years. They've got great systems. The people have been there forever. They know what to do. You know, that's probably a fairly low-risk type of subrecipient. Now let's contrast that with a brand new nonprofit. They don't even have QuickBooks. They're still operating on Excel spreadsheets. And you know, the person who's their executive director just started 2 days ago. Is the level of risk higher? Do I need to do more monitoring with them? That's why we're talking about assessing that risk and doing that very early in the process. Identify the restrictions. Agencies, I don't know if they love to do this, but they commonly put things in the terms and conditions of your award that probably most of you aren't even aware of. And if no one reads it and communicates it, it's pretty hard to stay in compliance. So we want to make sure that someone is identifying what those restrictions are. And they typically fall into, very small number of categories. Things like no food, no equipment, no capital expenditures, maybe a limit on how much indirect cost recovery we can do, things like that. Then we have to do something called design internal controls. Now, I spent most of my career as a corporate controller, so you might think that I have like some control issues. Most people working on grants, we're in this because we want to help people, right? And we'll do whatever it takes to help those people. The federal government, with the uniform guidance, shifted their focus on internal controls from it being just something that accountants and auditors worry about to everyone in the organization needs to be aware of internal controls. And now some of you may be going, internal controls, I didn't go to accounting, I went to something where I could care about people, not just numbers. Internal controls, you're probably doing a lot of them already. So let me ask you this. How many of you track your time in some method? Time card, time sheet, effort reporting? Okay. Does someone review that, like a supervisor, and approve it? How many of you have something like that happen with it? Yeah. That's a form of internal controls. How many of you can spend $10,000 without having any oversight whatsoever? Good. Oh, in my training on Tuesday, someone said they could spend $100,000 with no oversight. And I said, wow, okay, I want to talk to you more about that. But how that happens. So most times when we spend some money, we either have to have a purchase requisition, that somebody approves. Does this all sound familiar to you? Those are all forms of internal control. So you're probably already doing them. Just because we threw this accounting type word in here, it's kind of confusing everybody. But design controls so that we make sure our programs are doing what they're supposed to. And most importantly, because we want to help the people we're supposed to help. Almost every time when I do a case study of, our Blue Gene example, or $22 million in funds that were mismanaged, that I just did a case study on, it's because of a breakdown in internal controls. So basically people got to do whatever they wanted with the funds, and it wasn't always that they were out helping the folks, they were often out there helping themselves. And that's what the purpose of internal controls is. Number 5, train your staff. By the time you leave this session, you may know more than many federal agencies, folks working on programs. It's the weirdest thing to me. I train with grant recipients all over the place, and now I'm starting to have federal agencies send people to my classes because I guess they aren't training their own folks on this stuff. And I think, okay, the uniform guidance came out in 2013. That was 6 years ago. And it just was, people are not learning the right way to do it. My expectation for anyone is, how can you do it the right way if no one's ever even talked to you about what that is? That's not a realistic expectation. You do not become a grant manager through osmosis. It's not just like something in air that you breathe or something. Ensure competition. Now this is kind of getting down into the weedy details, but some of the largest dollar disallowances that I've been seeing lately have to do with the area of competition. And this is a procurement thing. When we get in this mode of, well, we've always used so-and-so and we're comfortable with them and let's just keep using them because we always have done that, that can be an expensive learning mistake. I did a case study on a community in Oklahoma. They had suffered from a tornado event and they had to pay back almost $4 million to FEMA. And the main thing they did is they just went out and hired the same old contractors to do what they had always done, and they did not go out and competitively procure the resources to repair the community after the tornado. And this is horrible, and it's horrible for a bunch of reasons, but one of the reasons it's horrible is because if costs are disallowed, that means you have to pay the money back. Okay, you have to pay the money back. It comes from non-federal sources. So your community, first of all, you got this money to help with the people, with whatever the problem was. Now they weren't helped because the money was misspent, and you got to pull money from some other program, some other area you could have helped people, and now you have to repay with those funds. So it's the worst double whammy ever. That's why one of my goals is that you never have costs disallowed. Number 7, you need to provide oversight. So people go, okay, well, yeah, I asked some questions. Is that enough? No. There's a saying in documentation, if it's not in writing, it doesn't exist. So if I talk to someone on the phone and I say, geez, have you had any audit findings? And they say, oh no, you never stop there, right? You might have to actually go look at their audit report on the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. Or you sending them an email that says, on this date we talked and you said this. And just a tip, when you have those verbal conversations with your program officers where they said, yeah, go ahead and spend the money that way, and you have that little feeling in your gut like, I'm not quite sure we're supposed to do that. You would be amazed when you start sending them an email saying, per our discussion this day, you said we could do this stuff, and they may go, well, wait a minute, let me check into that before you go further. Number 8, support allowability. And this speaks to not only having people understand what is allowable to charge with your grant, but also how do you do proper documentation. Now the term adequate documentation is pretty squishy. And a lot of people have a different interpretation of what adequate documentation means. From my standpoint, I want to be able to tell what the heck you did. And if I can't tell, you're not going to get the little E for effort or the participation ribbon. I'm just going to say, I can't tell, so we're not going to pay it. And this happens very frequently. So one of the areas that I suggest people is actually done on the common things like expense reports. You ever go to that restaurant and they give you that thing from your credit card that says you spent 24 bucks and you don't know what? That's not adequate documentation because I cannot tell what you did. I don't know if you bought $24 worth of beer or $24 worth of martinis, or you bought a burger when you were traveling on official business. So I need to know what you did. Or maybe you're getting those bills from consultants that just say, give me $5,000, give me $5,000, and they don't tell you what they did, they don't tell you when they did it, so you don't even know, is it in the period of performance or not? I have no idea from that. That is not adequate documentation. And then finally, and number 9, communicate results. One of the requirements as a grant recipient is that you have to provide timely, accurate, and complete reporting of what happened with your program. Now that seems very straightforward. Of course we would do that. But tell you what, I've sat in way too many meetings that go like this. I'm a finance folks, right? I'm finance folks. We're skeptical, you know, kind of sitting back. And the program's presenting all these numbers. And I look at these numbers and go, I don't know where you got those from. I've never seen any of those before in my life, right? They didn't ask me to run a report, so how do I know that you aren't just making those up on an Excel spreadsheet somewhere? This is what's going through my mind. In a collaborative way, of course, in a nice way. That's what's going through my mind. And from the other side of the fence, the program folks, you can have the most conscientious program manager in the world, and they ran their reports on Friday, you know, they're right on track, they're spending the money, everything's great, and they come in on Monday, and all their numbers have changed because the accounting department has done this voodoo thing called accrual accounting. Not cruel, but accrual accounting. And they've changed all the numbers on the poor program folks who thought they were on track, and now because you moved everything around, now I'm completely blown out of the water. So we have to communicate with each other. We have to communicate results not only to people like our funders, but also internally. We want to make sure, we don't want to have that discussion in front of our funder about, where'd you get those numbers from? I mean, that's never going to end well. Okay. And look upon that was not very nice. Look upon people who are auditors as partners. They have a wealth of experience. They follow trends just like everyone, you know, just like I do on, okay, what is the focus area now? And that's a good thing to know, because there are things that have come up with huge focus that did not come about as a result of the uniform guidance. They had a focus now, but the regulation was written back in the 1980s. You know, back in the 80s, I used to have these giant windshield glasses. Anybody who was around and born in the 80s might remember those. I was sorting pictures with my grandkids, and they're looking at them and going, oh, Grandma, yeah, that's not the look. I'm like, I love those. They were so good. They were so good. So communication is hard because it involves people, and then when you throw numbers in there and you throw auditors in there, it gets really messy. So partner with your auditors. And then finally, we're moved into the closeout. We think we're at the end of the journey, and we're like, whew, we spent the last dollar on the last day. Life is good. We are ready to go. And then what happens? We think we're all done, but we really aren't. We've just now entered this phase post-award where we might have some responsibilities, only no one's paying us to fulfill them because the funding has stopped. So when you are at the end of your award, you might, if you bought property, you might have some property management responsibilities. If you have expended more than $750,000, you might have to have an audit. Now I'm going to ask you a trick question here. I always want to see if I can trip you up here. If I get $1 million award and I haven't spent any of it, do I have to get an audit? How many say yes? Okay, some. Okay. If I get $1 million award and I haven't spent any of it, how many of you don't think I need to have an audit? Okay, and then how many of you will never raise your hand no matter what I say? Here's the trick, why it's a trick question. The key word is expenditure. So expenditures means I spent it. So if I don't spend any of that $1 million, I don't need to have a single audit. It's actually expenditures. Okay. Then sometimes you have something called program income. Now program income is something that's a little bit complicated. I'm not going to get too in the weeds. But let's say that I got a grant to build a museum and then people pay admission to go in. That might be program income. Or I got a grant to start a revolving loan fund for first-time home buyers. And now they're paying it back when either they sell the homes or maybe they're just paying it back over time. Might be program income. In your award terms and conditions, which at the very beginning I said someone needs to read, it will define what is program income and what you need to do with it, because there's different ways that you might have to treat it. And then finally, if you're getting indirect cost recovery, you might have to go back and do an adjustment once you have your final numbers. Okay? So that's another area that sometimes gets missed post-award. Yes? If you don't mind, just because we have people watching at home, if you could, this is where you get to jog down to the mic.
Yeah, quick question on audits.
Yes. It doesn't sound like.
Is that not on? Well, I can go really loud.
Oh, I think.
Is that on? I don't want to blow all your ears out.
I did. Okay.
Okay, so question is on audits, is that over the life? Like if you have a 5-year grant, is the $750 per year?
It is per year.
Got it.
And
Thank you.
it's all federal sources, not just one. So if
Okay.
you have 5 different grants, it all pools how much you've expended on
That's-
all of the
yeah.
different ones, and it is
Thank
per year. Yeah, good question, good question. So you can see, being a great grant manager does not mean that you necessarily have to know everything, but you do have to know enough to identify the risk to that specific grant and then figure out how do we make sure that our grant stays safe and sound. We don't want good grants gone bad, right? We don't want the spring break of grants happening to our grants. And the good news for you is that it is not a skill that you had to be born with. It's a skill that you can learn, and it is learnable. So there's a lot of good information out there. I'm going to share some at the end, but just one little tip that I'm going to give you is if you go out on something like LinkedIn or other social media and you use the Grant Info Friday, every Friday I post a tip sheet, a guide, a checklist, or something like that that just helps make your grant management easier. So anybody remember how I define success? Remember we talked about how do you define success? Anybody remember there was 2 ways that I define success when it comes to grants management? No disallowed costs. Yeah, good. Okay. And more grants. Good. You guys are paying attention. You're paying attention. All right. So now that we've kind of laid out, here's our roadmap. This is how we're going to get from point A to point B, which is to have our grants spent the way they're supposed to so that we can help the most people. Let's look at some strategies, not only for building relationships, but also some strategies for having better processes to help us with these 10 steps. So for those of you who forgot it already, we have our 10 steps here. And we're going to start with number 1 at the beginning. So how do we build relationships with others at the beginning? One way is we ask some questions. We don't take Lucy's tack and just assume that somebody must know what we're doing because we got $100 million. We ask some questions. Geez, are there any restrictions on that grant? Or, I see that you're using this indirect cost rate. Is that the latest one for the period that we're going to be actually doing the work in? Yes. Yeah, though I'm not sure.
Okay.
Okay. You don't have to run down.
Can you hear me? Yeah. I have found through NOFOs, through HHS, and through HRSA, when they have a technical assistance call where you can ask questions, all they do is repeat what's in the notebook. So how do you get an actual answer to a question rather than what you just read?
That's a great question. Let me repeat what you just said. Yeah, you'll find there's a wide variety between getting an answer that's helpful versus getting an answer where someone just parrots back the regulation that you just read. And I have not found, how do I put this delicately? I've not found that there's been a lot of insightful advice coming out of the federal agencies. So when you find that person who is insightful, I mean, you just have to cherish them, almost like an editor, you know, when you write grants. So a couple of suggestions that I would have is make sure you're asking the right people. So on your notice of funding opportunity, there typically is a contact person. I would make sure that I'm starting with that person versus somebody who's, you know, just happened to be on the call or whatever. Because they might want to do things in more general terms. Personally, I find someone reading me the regulation is not very helpful because I just read it. And when I would prefer if they could explain the terms, but you're not going to always get that. So that's why it's so important to have other colleagues that are also working in the field who might have similar questions or had similar things. And when it all comes down to, you have to take a reasonable approach. Now, some things are very cut and dry, right? How many of you know you can't buy beer with grant funds? Hopefully all of you know that. That's pretty cut and dry. But there's other areas where there's a little bit more gray area. So what's a reasonable approach? So that sometimes you just have to go, okay, we can't get a clear answer. I'm a documentation diva, so I'm going to say, you know what, we're going to document that we asked this question and did not get any further information, and so this is our approach, and I'm going to put that with that award as part of my documentation file, especially if it's something that I'm concerned could come back to bite us in the future.
It almost seems like they're afraid to answer anything.
I think they are. I think they are. Right. Because then what would happen? You would rely on it. And you'd say, they said I could. Yeah, that's why they won't. And then if you have program contributors, you know, that they're doing all maybe the cool science or they're doing the medical part or whatever, and you have budget people, let's start having these people talk very early in the relationship, not very late in the relationship. So maybe you have that meeting where everybody brings donuts. And then if you have an award that you did not get, oftentimes the reviewers will provide information, right? Why did you not get it? Oh, okay, well that's why we didn't get it. I was just talking yesterday to someone who was like, we applied for these grants and we didn't get it. I said, well, what did the reviewers say? Well, they said we were too advanced. I'm like, okay. And they said to come in year 3 because it was like a 5-year thing and everybody else was kind of starting with the baby steps and they were way down here. And I said, okay, what happened? Oh, well, we're going to apply for year 3 and we're going to get it. Okay, so listen to what your reviewer says. They're going to give you some good information. They might give you better information than the agency that you just asked to have you read you some regulations. And then have some kind of a process, like a kickoff meeting checklist, something like that, getting started checklist that identifies all the things that everybody needs to know about. Things like your deadlines, your sign-offs, maybe some special terms and conditions. Get people together so that they're starting that communication process early, not late. Why do you think it's important to start the communication process early? What happens when people are communicating right up front, right at the beginning of the process? Their expectations are more likely to be met.
They're less defensive.
They're less defensive because they feel involved in the process. Do you ever have those people that come down midstream and they go, I didn't like that decision you guys made? There's more ownership. If you have people involved early, then there's more ownership of the entire process so that people can collaborate better. Number 2, I said we're going to focus on risk. So how do we build relationships focusing on risk? First of all, we want to know how the funders define risk. They didn't give us a little checklist. They have something called a risk framework. It's kind of common sense things, but sometimes common sense isn't that common, as was observed by Voltaire. And each funder has a little bit different interpretation. So let's make sure we know what they're looking for. Why? Because I want to put that right in the grant application. I want a paragraph or 2 of standard language that addresses all their concerns because I want to signal to the funders, hey, we are ready for business. We are ready for your money. We know you have to do this risk assessment and we're going to communicate to you what's required. And then have the grant writers and the finance folks actually work together to define that language. And if there are some concerns in the kickoff meeting, let's get those out on the table and work to resolve them before we get too far downstream. So what are some process improvements that we could do? Again, have that standard language about what your funder is worried about. It's much better to just address it. Don't wait for them to have to ask you, because then they'll be like, ooh, what are they not telling us? If you control the message. You might have had some audit findings in the past, but you've addressed those and cleaned them up. I don't want the auditor to discover, I don't want the funder to discover that we had a problem. I want to be very upfront about it. Yes, we had a problem, but we fixed it. That's the type of thing they want to see. And then if we're using subrecipients, if we're passing dollars through, again, we want to formalize that process in some way where we have a standard process that we go through to assess how much monitoring do we have to do. It's on like the Head Start that's very experienced versus the one that's a brand new nonprofit. So we want to make sure that process is in place and you'll get in the groove. Oh yeah, it's time to do this assessment. Let's get that documented and on our books. Number 3, we want to identify the restrictions. So one of my suggestions is have someone, and I call them a NOFO navigator, because I love alliteration, so that's why I had to do that. But who's responsible for communicating restrictions to the rest of the team? You know, if you just send a contract or an agreement to your legal department, they may not feel any ownership in actually communicating that. So who is actually going to be the navigator to say, whoop, there's these 5 things, we got to worry about that, and then communicate them out to the team. And if someone's going to be affected by those restrictions, like my example of the program that got the award and no longer had a funding for a program director, Have we told them, have we brought them in the loop about what some of these issues are and brought them in early? The earlier you can identify issues, the more time you have to resolve them. If you wait until you're in the last 2 weeks when you haven't spent all the money and you're trying to run around and like, we have to spend $40,000 in the next 2 days, you don't have much time, you don't have much wiggle room. From a process standpoint, again, create just a standard template for communication of all of these different restrictions and then make sure that gets spread out around. And you might even think about something called a communication matrix. And what that is just like it sounds, it's not like the Matrix movie, but it's a matrix of everyone from senior leadership to program staff who needs to be aware of certain things. Do you think the accounting department needs to know if the indirect cost rate recovery is limited? Yes, they do. Now, sometimes I've gone out and trained at organizations, and the finance department's been told by the program folks that they don't have the right to even see the budget. Well, that's not a great environment, because you kind of have to have finance people with the ability to see what's going on in the budget. But it happens sometimes. Number 4, design controls. There's that controlling thing. A lot of us don't like that idea of control. Sometimes we have people who get federal dollars that think they can spend it however they want. Now, I'm sure no one in this room ever feels that way, but I've gotten in a little bit of a tussle sometimes with program folks who want to do things that maybe they're just a little bit to the gray area, and it's not even a financial concern, but it's a public perception concern. When you're spending federal dollars, we have to always be aware of what the public is thinking about things. So I want to have controls in there that not only look at the financial aspect, but also kind of the relationship aspect of what would our funder say if they found that out. So I'm going to ask finance, if we have any finance folks in the room, I hope you'll go home and think about how do I communicate internal controls to the rest of the organization? Because maybe you just learned that's a requirement of your federal grant, and you have to think, okay, how do we communicate? The first thing I'm going to tell all the finance folks in the room is let's not use jargon, because we don't like it when it's used on us by other folks, so let's not use a bunch of jargon. And even the term internal controls to me feels very jargony. I think if you say checks and balances, most people know what you're talking about. You want some checks and balances to make sure that we don't have fraud happening. That's a pretty important thing. And then talk to the program folks. They might have some really good ideas. We just have to listen. We have to communicate what those ideas may be. Build those relationships with your program folks and your finance folks. Some other controls is actually have some training. That means somebody's going to have to sit in a presentation with some PowerPoint and learn more about internal controls, but make them relevant to me as an employee. If I have to fill out a timesheet, I probably need to know who has to approve it. But it would be also good for me to know why they have to approve it. Oh, that's part of our requirement for our grants, and it helps reduce the risk of fraud. Okay, I can get on board with that. And then periodically you have to do something called monitoring. Monitoring means you're not assuming that everybody's doing the right thing. You're actually checking to see if they do. I've done a lot of case studies where time and effort dollars, labor dollars, have been disallowed by federal agencies because the auditors came in and they went out to the floor or the program and they said, okay, how do you charge your time? And the person's response was, I just put what's budgeted. That's like if I had a big buzzer, I go, eh. That is always the wrong answer, right? Because we have to charge what we actually did, not what we were budgeted. Now, could they be the same thing? They could, but it's not, you don't charge what's budgeted just because, oh, that's just what's in the budget. I have to charge what I did. And that, to me, is a lack of training employees on what the expectations are. I don't want to have millions of dollars disallowed just because I didn't take 5 minutes to go, remember, John, remember, Jane, that when you fill out your time card, you want to make sure you put what you actually did, not just what you were budgeted. All right, number 5. Do you have any HR folks in the room? All right. I almost never get HR. HR and IT never seem to come along, so I want to applaud you for being here. Especially with this step, because I want to identify, I want your HR folks to help you identify training gaps. Now, I wish some of the federal agencies had done this too, but if you have people who worked on grants for 20 years, and I commonly have them in trainings, and they've never gotten any training on grants, or I have someone who just started last week and has not gotten any training in grants, that's not going to have the best possible outcome because they don't know what to do. And maybe they're doing things, they've always done them this way. Things have changed with the uniform guidance. We can't rely on how we've always done things. And I also want to set some expectations and do onboarding with brand new employees so that they understand this money is not ours to spend however we want. We have to spend this prudently because it's taxpayer dollars. I worked with an agency or an organization, and what they wanted to do, they had a bunch of field work to do, and they thought, I know, let's buy a bunch of Humvees. Wouldn't that be fun to go all around doing our field work in Humvees? And I bet it would be fun. I can't deny them that. But is the public perception of a Humvee different than a Ford F-350 white work truck? Right? One's the work truck, and the other is what? Some kind of a specialty vehicle or SUV or whatever you want to call it. Now, is the dollars that different? Probably not. I mean, those Ford F-350s, they're pretty pricey. But the public perception is different. So sometimes we have to think not just with the dollars, but also what does it look like to the public. And that's why you commonly see indirect cost limitations on things like HHS grants and Department of Education grants, is because the agencies don't want that public perception, and neither do the legislators, that says we're going to let universities charge an 80% indirect cost on the backs of the children or the backs of the elderly. And that's why typically agencies that serve the most vulnerable populations will limit that indirect cost, because they don't want that public perception of what's going on with high indirect cost rates. Some processes. Again, if you have standardized training, it becomes really easy. You don't have to go, oh, I'm going to have to sit down for the whole weekend and put together PowerPoint slides. Have some kind of standardized process so that everybody understands both directly on the program and working in other areas like procurement, especially procurement, and finance, and even HR and IT, that they understand what the requirements are. And then train on what is adequate documentation. That's something that feels really squishy. Feels very squishy to me, but there's some general guidelines that I can give people. You know, it's kind of that who, what, where, what. Who, what, where, when. I probably missed one in there. What's the other one? How. Yeah. So have some standard processes. Number 6, make sure that you do adequate competition. Now, many of you may not actually be doing this. When you're going, oh, that's procurement that does this. Who's putting the pressure on procurement? Probably you working on the program saying, we need this on Friday and today is Thursday at 5 o'clock. So you have to give procurement enough time to go out and do their requirements, which are to provide adequate competition. So enlist procurement in actually saying, hey, this is how much time we need. This is what our process is. Make sure that everybody knows what the requirements are. Maybe make those procurement folks get up and actually do a little training for folks. And then there's another relationship that we haven't talked about a lot, and that has to do with helping small businesses, women-owned firms, and minority-owned firms. That's not a nice to do anymore. That's a requirement. And so part of the competition requirements include building those relationships with your community. Now, it may be building relationships with qualified small businesses, but it also may be building relationships with organizations like the Small Business Administration or the local Small Business Development Center that is already engaging with those types of clients and say, hey, we have these procurements coming up, so we need your help. From a process standpoint, we want to make sure that we're communicating these requirements not just once, but multiple times, because sometimes there's turnover on the program staff and you might have a new employee there. If you don't have any onboarding that's happening with grants, they may not know, oh, you mean we can't just use Joe's Plumbing, who we've always used Joe's Plumbing. Things like that. And then I also suggest if you have standard forms, like a purchase requisition form, maybe you want to incorporate some of these competition requirements into the form so people know, oh, wait a minute, I've got to think about this. We need to include 2 quotes. Or maybe we don't need quotes, but we need to show that it's reasonable, like that we bought it on Amazon, there was 5 choices and we made one of those. Things like that. Incorporate those into your form. All right, number 7, oversight. There's 2 main types of oversight that you're doing with your federal grant. One has to do with contractors. That's what procurement typically does. And one is what you're doing with subrecipients. I kind of feel like I've left this side of the room off, so I'm hopefully not going to drive the photographer crazy here. So from a procurement standpoint, they have the primary responsibility for contractor oversight. And what that means is, are our contractors doing what they said they do? So if any of you have ever gotten, maybe you've hired a consultant, does that bill get paid just when it comes in? No questions asked? No. I hope not. Does somebody who should be in the position to know the work was done actually have to review it, maybe sign off on it? Okay, you just did some internal controls again. That information, let's say they're billing for things they didn't get done. That feedback needs to go to that procurement department so that they can identify, hey, we've got an issue with this contractor. I was just doing a case study about the city of Baltimore. Did anybody from Baltimore here? Okay, I don't want to pick on Baltimore, but it's been in the news about the mayor of Baltimore. She served on a board of a nonprofit, and one of the questions was that I think led to her resigning was she had written a book, and it wasn't clear that when she was paid $100,000 for the books, whether the books were ever delivered. So I got $100,000 for my books, but did anybody ever take ownership of those books and do anything with them? Again, that's all part of making sure that you have those relationships. So procurement is saying, wait a minute, we're paying for this. Did we actually get it or not? And then whoever is doing sub-awardee monitoring, that might be your program, it could be some other department, also needs to make sure that it's getting done and it's being documented. This is an area that auditors love, love, love to check because it's pretty easy to tell whether or not you've done any. It's not sufficient to just call them up and talk to them. You need to document that you're doing that oversight as well. So from a process standpoint, the more things that you can standardize, the easier your life gets. One of the very first things in your process should be identifying, do we have a sub-award relationship or do we have a contractor relationship? Has anybody gone through some of those questionnaires for contractors versus subrecipients? Yeah. Is it like, boy, it's so easy to tell sometimes? No. When you have, and then this is the reason that this matters is if you have a subrecipient, you have to have the approval of your funder to have them. So if you don't identify them correctly and you pay them and they should have been a subrecipient, they could disallow all those costs, which violates Lucy's, what makes Lucy, sad. So when you think about subrecipients and contractors, you're not thinking about, oh, if we check this one box, then they're one or the other. You're thinking about more of like I called it a teeter-totter, but I think that's a Minnesota term. There's some other term for that, the thing you sit on as a kid and go, seesaw. So it's more of a seesaw. If you answer all these questions, which way does the seesaw lean? Is it this way or that way? And we have to make that determination early because we need to know what type of oversight we need to provide. And then again, make sure you have adequate documentation. Don't just talk to them on the phone. Number 8. Any questions about this? How do we build relationships that support accountability? One of the things I challenge finance to do is actually tell people, where do we find what things are allowable or not? There's something called the selective items of cost that's in the uniform guidance, and it lists the most common types of costs you'll encounter with your grants. Why do we make that some kind of a hidden document? Let's put that out on a shared drive somewhere so that if somebody wants to know if they can pay for relocation, they can look it up just as well as I can. I don't need to cut and paste it into an email, but I could because it's out there. And just make it really easy for people to be compliant. We don't want gotchas. We want it to be easy for people to be compliant. And then have that open discussion. Sometimes we get program folks that are kind of trying to, skirt the line a little bit, but you can also have finance folks too that are putting a bunch of things into their indirect costs that a program folk may know that that's a problem. You're not supposed to be taking out the finance staff to pizza every Friday. That's not going to fly. So things like that. Number 8, as I said, from a process standpoint, make it easy for people to be compliant. Share that information where everybody knows where it is. That is one of your central resources on what is an allowable cost or what isn't. And then if you are doing cost allocations, how many of you do any cost allocations? Anybody? Okay. If you're doing them, use the language the funders expect in your allocations. If I am going to do an allocation for facilities, for example, what would be kind of a common sense way to allocate facility costs? Let's say I have a program using half of the square footage of a building. What would be a good way to allocate the costs?
Prorate.
prorated based on square footage. Yeah, wouldn't that kind of make sense? But sometimes people, I won't say accountants are getting creative, but sometimes they come up with these convoluted, complicated cost allocations based on salary and this and that. And I say, why? All you've done is created friction in the communication with your agency because they want the thing they expect. They don't want some new, brand new, innovative approach to cost allocation. They want what they expect, which is square footage, things like that. So try to use the common methods. Number 9, this is Lucy's favorite because communication is a component of strong internal controls. It's not just a soft skill, it's not just a nice to do, it actually is part of how you support internal controls. So how do we communicate results? First of all, do your board members, if you have a board, do they have a relationship with their audit partners? Do they feel comfortable talking to their auditors about what the auditors are seeing? Oftentimes on boards, especially nonprofit boards, they're more focused on the mission than the finance stuff, right? The audit committee may or may not be all that active. Get those relationships going so that if the board members are concerned about something, they have a resource that may not just be management's word for things. And also so the audit partners have a resource at the board that they feel like the board's paying attention. I was doing a case study on the Baltimore case with the mayor, and what actually to me was a much bigger story was the board of the Maryland, and I'll probably get this wrong, University of Maryland Healthcare Systems was the board. And there was a number of the board members that made the mayor look like kind of like an angel, because they had much more conflicted relationships than even the mayor did with the books that may or may not have gotten delivered. And my favorite quote of all time, which I'm going to use in a future training, was, and I'm going to paraphrase, but one of the board members who's now on leave said something to the effect of, well, why would you serve on a board if you couldn't get some financial benefit from it? Well, maybe because you care about the mission, but that's just me. So watch that. Make sure that there's good relationships going on between your board and your audit partners. File the reports on time. If you are one of those people who are constantly late filing the reports with your federal funder, let me tell you what's going through their mind. I mean, this is, I'll put my auditor's hat on, not just Uncle Sam's hat. One of two things. And neither of them are that you don't know how to read a calendar. The first thing that's going through my mind is you have bad news and you are afraid to tell me, because no one wants to be the bearer of bad news. Number 2, things are so chaotic at your organization you can't even produce a report. That's what's going through my mind. So when you file your reports on time, you're actually building credibility with your agency so that they go, oh yeah, we like them, because they're not the problem children, right? They're the ones who are going to actually get everything in on time. And encourage that both finance and the program staff work together collaboratively on getting the reports out so that finance is comfortable that the numbers are real and the program folks are comfortable that they're getting the information they need and the support they need as well. From a process standpoint, have a shared calendar. It should not be a mystery to anybody what these dates are. Right? We have this coming up. It comes up. It's like, when you're surprised at Christmas, you're like, oh, how did it get to be Christmas? I meant to start that Christmas club savings last year. Have a shared calendar so that everybody knows what's expected. And if there's a problem in the quality of the reports, and again, this is something that I see fairly commonly in audit findings, where the numbers don't actually tie to any reality in the financial records, identify how that's happening. Get to the root cause of it and fix it. Sometimes we think we have to wait till the auditors find something to fix it. No. If you have a problem, fix it before the auditors. It's much better for you to have fixed it, and then when the auditors encounter it, you go, yep, that was a problem, but we addressed it. I mean, doesn't that just make a much smoother type of relationship? Number 10, post-award. This is what gets overlooked. Designate someone or some team to be your post-award team so that these things don't get lost. Because what happens, we get to the end of the program, and then everybody moves on to other things. So nobody's really paying attention, and the ball gets dropped. So think about, how do we have a post-award team to maintain all those continued requirements? Yes?
Can I ask you, do you mean post-closeout?
Yes.
Because sometimes in our world, post-award means anything after you submit the grant proposal.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah, thank you for being a better communicator than me. I mean after the period of performance. Yeah, thank you. And then when the award's over, you may have some additional reporting that's required. who do you have to report that to? Because just like in your organization, your staff has moved on to the next award, possibly so have all of your funder staff moved on to another award. So if you have a question, who's going to be that contact person? Think about a debrief. What went well? What didn't go so well? Let's talk about it so that we can make improvements for the future. And then let's have a standard template because it's going to be the same types of thing. Who's going to report the property? Who's going to be tracking it? All those types of things. Who's going to report the audit results? Just lay all that out because it's going to happen pretty much every single time. So don't let it be a mystery. So in conclusion, when you do a good job with grants management, and for Lucy that looks like success by not having any disallowed costs and by getting more grants, the funder is more likely to continue funding whatever you need in your community. And trust me, there's a lot of money. How much? Anybody remember how much money that is? Over $755 billion are going out. If the public sees that the money is being well spent and not it's the little shrimp on the treadmill, anybody follow those research grants with the shrimp on the treadmill? When they see that the money is being spent to actually help communities, they're more likely to support it. But most importantly, it's not just for the rules' sake, it's about helping the people in our community that need the help. The money is there to help the people in our community. The more that we can do a good job with grant management, the more people we can help. So if you'd like a copy of the full roadmap, you can go to myfedtrainer.com/roadmap and you can download it from there. So I saw some of you snap and pics, that's fine, but if you'd actually like to print it out, go ahead to that. Anybody who needs to take a picture, I'll wait till that's done. Okay, some other ways to connect with me. My email address is on there. That's probably the fastest way to get a hold of me. We started a new podcast last July. I'm actually interviewing some folks, some other presenters here, and so those will be coming out next year, called the Grant Talks Podcast. So check that out on iTunes and at granttalks.com. Second edition of Decoding Grant Management just was released to be updated with the new procurement methods and a few other things. And again, it doesn't say on here, but Grant Info Friday hashtag. If you use that on social media, you'll find a ton of resources to help you as well. So, any questions? We have a few more minutes if anyone has any questions. Yes?
I'm very new to the federal process. This is a very good question. You mentioned a lot of things we need to read to find out more.
Mm-hmm.
Where do I find stuff?
So the place I always start is I read. Oh, sure. So the question is, he's kind of new, and I refer to read this, read that, and check on that. The first place, what's the best place to start? Is that a fair summary? Okay. So the first place that I would suggest, and even if you don't do it, that someone in your team reads the terms and conditions of the award agreement from the federal government. In there, it will tell you what rules do we have to follow. It will tell you if there's any special types of restrictions. All those things should appear in your actual award agreement. And sometimes it may say, here's your stuff, but then go look at this place for your terms and conditions, and it's the standard terms and conditions. So that will refer you over to that agency's specific terms and conditions. And that's the first place to start, because I don't know why, but we just we get that software agreement, we just check the box and say, I agree. This is a case someone has to actually read it and then communicate these types of restrictions. Yeah, that's where I would start. It's shorter than the uniform guidance usually, so less stuff to worry about, but that's a great question. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah.
It says, do you have any suggestions for templates for a lot of these standardized reporting and training policies?
I would start with going out on the hashtag Grant Info Friday, and then make Google your friend, because there's a lot of it. Let's say I work in a community college and I'm kind of wondering about what other community colleges are doing. A lot of times those will be out if you just search template for whatever it is, time and effort reporting, template for subrecipient versus contractor determination, all those types of things. Google's a great resource. And I'm not saying we're stealing anybody's stuff, but it's good to have things to model from. It makes it a better product for everybody. Yep. Any other questions? Well, thank you for your attention. I hope to see you in another presentation later.